Diego Maradona, out in cinemas now, a documentary film about the obviously legendary football player. The film is made by Asif Kapadia, and I want to start with the director because he has previously made Senna, a documentary also about Ayrton Senna, possibly the best F1 driver in history, and then Amy, another documentary, this time about Amy Winehouse, the famous singer who lost her life to drug and alcohol abuse. So now coming into another biographical documentary, comparisons are natural, especially as he himself, the director himself, calls Diego Maradona the third part in a trilogy of those documentaries about young prodigies and fame. Now, I have seen both Senna and Amy, and I think they are both excellent, so my expectations were rather high, even though I am personally not a big fan of football or Maradona himself. And I have to say I was severely disappointed by the film. The first main problem is that walking out at the end, I didn't really feel like I learned any new meaningful information about the footballer. I previously knew just the basic stuff. He was a fantastic player, he scored a pivotal goal with his hand, he liked to party and to take drugs, and that last thing, coupled with his connections to the Italian mob, sort of ruined his career. And it's pretty much the story the movie tells us. It focuses on Maradona's time in Napoli, from mid-1980s to the early 1990s, when he was suspended because of his drug use. It shows us how he arrived in this really weak team, but instantly was revered by all the football fans in Napoli, which is all the people in Napoli. And then as he carried the team to become the champions of Italy multiple times and win some European Cups even. All the while his personal life slowly went to shit because of his partying, cocaine abuse, connections to the local Camorra, and strained relationships. One example would be his son, who he didn't even acknowledge for many, many years. And as he was on this downward spiral, we also get to see how the fans' perception of him changed through the years and shifted from him being this lovable icon put on a pedestal almost next to God himself, to people basically hating him, which obviously also took a heavy toll on Maradona himself. Problem is, vast majority of this stuff is public knowledge and previously known footage, like his games, locker room celebrations and banter, recordings from parties, his interviews with the press. There are little snippets of commentary from Maradona himself, from what also sounds like an interview from later on in his life, and some insight from journalists and historians, but none of it really feels like it's new information, a new personal look into the life and the mind of Maradona. There's not a lot of that direct insight into why he did the things that he did, how did it all happen, what was he thinking at the time. And I think that is usually, all those things, they are usually the strength of a good documentary. They reveal something completely new, whether it's information or just a different perspective on what we have previously known. And this film just feels like a very safe and generic compilation of YouTube videos, along with some excerpts from Wikipedia. Now, that in itself wouldn't necessarily cross the movie completely in my eyes. I think you can still tell a story that is well known as long as you tell it well. You need to figure out what angle you want to take. What is it that you really want to say with the movie? Define a structure. Make it have a clear beginning, middle, and an end. And I think this part is what was done exceptionally well in both Senna and Amy. And the reason is rather clear. It's easier to make a movie build towards something when the center character actually died young. In both those pictures, you know that death is creeping around the corner, so there is that feeling of moving somewhere, of things having a definite end. With Maradona, you obviously don't have that, and his suspension is used instead as this sort of climax, the end of the film. Problem is, almost the entire movie before it has this weird structure and pacing that just feels like it's going nowhere. We're just shown, oh, and then this happened, and then that happened, and here's another match that he played. Cool, I guess. But there's no sense of urgency, no tempo to the film. It's kind of just meandering and unstructured. And I was actually quite bored by some parts of it. I actually checked my watch a couple of times, which is never a good sign. And I wondered for a minute afterwards if maybe this has something to do with me just not being that interested in the subject matter. But then I remembered that just a couple of days ago I have seen Free Solo, a documentary about rock climbing, which I have zero interest in, even less than football. And I was floored by it and gripped by it the whole time. But this one is just not very engaging. I think it partly ties back to that thing that we have very little new, unknown, personal stuff revealed about Diego that is now coming to light. But on a grander scale, I have to say, it just looks like the movie didn't really have a good idea of what it wanted to be, what it wanted to do with itself, if that makes sense. There isn't that one tight central narrative that would just take you on a ride, and the result is quite mediocre. Thinking about it again, I think maybe I was not the target audience as well. Maybe someone who doesn't know anything about Maradona would be satisfied with this story and not worry that it just skimmed the surface. And then again, maybe someone who is a massive fan would be able to enjoy it for being this sort of nostalgic film that compiles his most famous moments. But I'm in that middle point, knowing just enough not to be surprised, but also not enough to care more about Maradona himself. So I'm sorry to say, but it didn't work for me.